He was a quiet, grieving father, just trying to raise his troubled son in an old cabin tucked deep in the woods. She was a desperate mother of 3, starving, exhausted, and completely out of options. When their worlds collided by chance, no one could have predicted what would grow from that moment. Not just survival, not just healing, but a love story that would prove even the most broken hearts can become someone's miracle. This is a story about second chances, quiet acts of kindness, and the kind of love that takes root when you least expect it. If stories like this warm your heart, consider subscribing to Soul Moments. Story, we share true-to-life tales of hope, love, and redemption meant to uplift, inspire, and remind you the smallest kindness can change everything. Let's begin. The Vermont sun blazed high over the trees, unforgiving. In its July heat, Caleb Whitmore trudged up the dusty trail, an axe slung over his shoulder, his shirt clinging to his back. It was supposed to be a simple day. Cut some firewood, check the fencing, and fix the leaky window in the spare room. But then again, no day had felt simple since Amanda died. The woods were quiet, save for the crunch of his boots and the occasional buzz of dragonflies skimming puddles left by last week's storm. Caleb moved with the weariness of a man who had learned to carry more than his share of grief, of work, of silence. At 42, he looked older than he should, though his shoulders remained broad and his hands still calloused from labor. Just as he turned off the trail to cut through the thicket, he heard a muffled cough, then another faint, strained human. Caleb froze. It came again, and this time it was followed by a soft whimper, like that of a child. His feet moved before his brain did pushing through low branches and brush, until he came upon something wholly out of place. A faded blue pickup truck nestled awkwardly among the trees, half hidden in tall grass. The engine was cold, the tires partly sunk into the dirt, and inside he saw them 4 figures. The woman in the front seat was slumped sideways, hair matted to her face, skin flushed red with heat. In the back seat, 3 little girls, triplets, no older than 5, lay tangled together in sleep or exhaustion, their cheeks pale and lips cracked. Caleb knocked gently on the window. No response. He opened the driver's side door. The woman startled awake, eyes wild for a second, then flooded with dread as she saw him. I'm sorry, she rasped. We didn't mean to. We just needed some shade. I'll go. You're not going anywhere in this heat, Caleb said calmly. I live up that ridge. Water. Food. Come on, she blinked at him, her voice trembling. Please. My girls. He nodded. Let's get them out of here. She introduced herself along the way. Sophie Barrett. Her voice cracked every few words as she carried Hazel, while Caleb lifted Ruby and Lila in his arms. The girls barely stirred, too weak even to protest. Caleb glanced sideways at Sophie. She couldn't have been older than her mid-30s, but her face carried years he knew all too well. His cabin wasn't large, but it was clean, cool, and still held the scent of cedar. He ushered them inside where his son Miles sat at the kitchen table, lining up plastic dinosaurs in rigid, symmetrical rows. The boy looked up wide-eyed. He didn't say anything. He rarely did with strangers. These are guests, Bud, Caleb said softly. Just for a little while, Miles gave a slight nod, then returned to his dinosaurs. It was more than Caleb expected. A good sign. Sophie laid the girls on the worn couch as Caleb brought water and sandwiches. She tried to wave him off. We can't accept this. I didn't mean to. But he silenced her with a simple, quiet look that said, I've been there too. That night, the girls slept like stones. Miles lingered at his door, staring curiously at the unfamiliar hum of life in their once silent home. Caleb stepped onto the porch. Sophie joined him a few minutes later, wrapped in one of his old flannel shirts, I was a school teacher, she said, suddenly. Before everything fell apart, before he lost his job, started drinking, before I stopped recognizing the man I married, Caleb didn't interrupt. He knew that tone. Part apology, part survival. He hit me once I forgave him. Then again. Well, I didn't wait for the third. The cicadas buzzed in the still air. My wife died, Caleb said after a pause. 6 years ago, Miles was 4. It was fast complications. Unexpected. Everything broke after that. They stood in silence. But it wasn't empty. I'm sorry, she whispered. So am I, he answered. He turned back toward the house. There's a spare room. It's not much, but... Her eyes welled up, but she blinked them away. Thank you for not asking too many questions. I figure life already asked you enough. Inside, Miles sat in the hallway, knees pulled to his chest. Caleb knelt down beside him. Too loud, he asked. Miles shook his head. Too different. Another. Shake. Then quietly, she smells like cookies. Caleb let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. That's a good smell, huh? Miles nodded. Caleb stood and peeked into the living room. Sophie lay curled up beside the girls, one arm draped across Hazel. Her chest rose and fell in slow, steady breaths. Her face had softened in sleep. Less fear, more peace. He walked up the attic stairs later that night, his own mind buzzing. Amid the dust and old boxes, he pulled open a drawer and found it a notebook with Amanda's handwriting on the cover. Things will do. One day, he sat there a long time, flipping through half-sketched garden plans and scribbled pie recipes, wondering what Amanda would think of the woman sleeping below. When he finally crawled into bed, the house no longer felt so empty. The morning sun stretched long fingers across the wooden floor of the cabin, catching dust motes, midair, like fireflies trapped in honey. Caleb awoke to the scent of toast, not the burned kind he was used to, but something rich and warm and vaguely spiced. For a second, he thought he was dreaming. Amanda used to make cinnamon toast on weekends. He could almost hear the hum of her voice in the kitchen. But it wasn't Amanda. It was Sophie. She stood barefoot at the stove, wearing the same flannel shirt from the night before. Her hair twisted into a loose braid. The girls were giggling at the table, their cheeks already fuller from the sandwich, and sleep Lila was drawing suns on a napkin. Ruby was arranging blueberries into a face on her plate. Hazel, the quietest, clung to Sophie's side, but peeked around every so often with wide, solemn eyes. Caleb rubbed the sleep from his eyes. You didn't have to cook. I didn't sleep much, she said. And your pantry's better stocked than I expected. You'd be amazed what an old guy with a Costco membership can stash, he replied dryly. She smiled. It was the first real one he'd seen on her face, not just polite, genuine. And for a flicker of a moment, it softened something in him that had been hard for too long. Miles padded in silent as a shadow. He paused at the doorway, blinking at the new configuration of bodies in his space. Sophie turned and met his eyes gently. Good morning, Miles, she said softly. He didn't answer, but he didn't retreat either. He walked over to the table, sat on the edge of his usual chair, and began lining up blueberries in perfect symmetry. Sophie said nothing more. She just placed a plate in front of him and returned to the stove. Caleb noticed she didn't push, she didn't hover. She gave Miles exactly the space he needed, and nothing more. It was the kind of sensitivity most people didn't have, the kind Caleb had been forced to cultivate over years of trial, error, and heartbreak. Later that morning, after the girls had run outside to chase butterflies and dig up imaginary treasure in the garden, Sophie found Caleb in the workshop behind the house. He was sanding a broken chair leg, surrounded by tools and bits of half-finished projects. She held out something to him, a small envelope handwritten on the front. For Mr. Whitmore. From all of us. He took it confused. Inside was a folded piece of notebook paper covered in crayon scribbles, flowers, hearts, and a child's uneven letters. Thank you for the food and the soft couch, and for being nice to Mommy. We love your house. At the bottom, in more practiced handwriting, Sophie had added. They asked to write a thank you note. I figured it couldn't hurt. Caleb stared at the note longer than he meant to. I hope it's okay, Sophie added a little nervously. I've always believed gratitude should be practiced, like a habit, not just felt. He looked up. Voice low, Amanda used to say the same thing. Sophie's face changed, gentled by understanding. She was your wife. He nodded. She wrote thank you cards for every holiday, every casserole, every bouquet of flowers, even the ones I picked from the side of the road. Sophie chuckled. Sounds like my kind of woman. Caleb carefully placed the note on a nearby shelf, as if it were something fragile. Then he turned back to the chair leg, sanding in slow, even motions. She made this chair, he said. After a while, I've been meaning to fix it for 6 years. Sophie didn't ask why it took so long. She didn't need to. That afternoon, the girls discovered the attic ladder. Lila had seen the string dangling from the ceiling in the hallway and tugged on it before anyone could stop her. The ladder creaked down, unfolding like a secret. No, wait, Caleb called, reaching them just as they were about to climb, but Sophie stepped in. First, calm and clear. Girls, this isn't our house. We ask first, remember? Lila's shoulders drooped. Sorry, Caleb knelt beside her. It's okay, but it's old up there. Dusty, sharp corners. Can we go, if we're careful? Ruby asked, eyes wide. He hesitated, then sighed. All right, 10 minutes. I'll go with you. They climbed up together, the girls bubbling with excitement. The attic was cluttered, but harmless boxes, old suitcases, a rocking horse with one eye missing. Caleb hadn't been up there in months, maybe years. Hazel found the cookie tin first. It was tucked in a corner beneath a stack of outdated calendars and a faded Christmas wreath. She opened it and gasped. Letters, she whispered. Hundreds of them. Some folded neatly. Some crumpled. Some addressed to no one at all. Sophie lifted one and read it quietly. Her face went still. These are for Amanda, she said. Caleb nodded. I wrote her letters after she passed, just to say the things I never got to when she was here. Sophie held his gaze. Do you still write them? No, he said, and something in his voice cracked. I stopped when I realized I wasn't writing for her anymore. I was writing to hold on to pain. There was a long silence. Then Sophie knelt beside the girls, her fingers brushing the edges of the letters. Maybe it's time to write something new. It had been years since Caleb stepped into the backyard garden with anything more than a passing glance. Once it had been Amanda's sanctuary, her hands in the soil, her laughter tangled in the sunflowers, her lavender blooming along the picket fence like a promise of better days. After she passed, the weeds grew faster than Caleb's will to pull them, but on the third morning after Sophie and the girls arrived, he heard humming, not the drone of bees or the static of cicadas. This was human, warm, familiar. He followed the sound past the shed and around the back of the cabin, and there she was. Sophie knelt in the soil, sleeves rolled up, hair pinned back with a twig, her hands already stained with dirt. Around her, the triplets were collecting stones, giggling as they compared shapes. Hazel held a jar of worms. Ruby was planting a stick, like it was a flag. Lila twirled with a handful of dandelions, her dress stained at the hem with grass and joy. Caleb leaned on the porch, railing, silent, watching. He hadn't touched the garden in nearly 6 years, and here it was, dug up, turned over, breathing again. Sophie looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Hope you don't mind. The girls needed something to do." Caleb blinked. "You found the old tools in the shed, under a family of very angry spiders." He chuckled despite himself. "The soil's not bad," she added, brushing dirt off her knee. "Could grow herbs. Tomatoes, maybe. There's even a strawberry patch trying to fight its way through the weeds." Caleb looked at the spot Amanda had planted those strawberries their second year in the cabin. She'd called them her hope berries. "Didn't think anything would still grow," he said quietly. Sophie glanced at him, then at the ground. "Things want to grow. You just have to give them a reason." Later that day, the girls brought in handfuls of mint and thyme. Sophie had found, still clinging to life beneath the overgrowth. She crushed a few leaves and placed them into a pot of water on the stove, filling the cabin with a scent so vivid, Caleb had to sit down. It smelled like their first summer in the house, when Amanda wore sundresses and Miles toddled through the grass with a toy truck, when life still felt open. Sophie stirred a pot of oatmeal with sliced apples and honey, humming a melody Caleb recognized as something old and Appalachian. She moved around the kitchen with instinct, not ownership, like someone who understood how to share space without taking it over. Miles stood in the hallway watching Lila, skipped up to him, held out a leaf. "Smell this, it's mint, lichen gum," he hesitated. Sophie noticed and stepped in. "Hey, Lila, remember what we talked about? Some people need a little more space. Just let him be for now." Lila tilted her head. "Okay," she gave Miles a small wave. "I'll show you my rock collection later if you want." She darted off, leaving the scent of crushed mint in her wake. Miles stared after her, then looked up at his father. Caleb gave a gentle nod. "She's loud, huh?" Miles nodded. "But she's kind." That night, Sophie and the girls stayed up folding laundry and telling silly stories on the living room floor. Caleb watched from the kitchen, fixing a broken drawer that hadn't shut properly in years. "Why do they all talk at the same time?" he asked, half laughing. Sophie grinned. "Triplets. It's their love language. You don't find it exhausting. I find it alive." She paused, her smile fading into something softer. "There was a time I thought I'd never hear them laugh again. Now I don't mind the chaos." Caleb didn't say anything, but he understood. Deeply. As the girls drifted off to sleep, Sophie picked up a book from the shelf, an old gardening guide with Amanda's handwriting in the margins. She traced a note on the inside cover. "Build trellis. Let the beans climb." She looked over at Caleb. "Your wife was hopeful, relentlessly. She'd be proud of the man you are now. The one who lets strangers in and fixes broken drawers." He didn't know what to say to that. So instead, he walked over to the coat closet, pulled out an old shoebox and handed it to her. Inside were seed packets, some expired, some still sealed. He hadn't thrown them out. "Not really." Sophie looked up at him, surprised. "Is this a yes?" "It's a maybe," he said, "which is more than it used to be." She smiled, not the grateful kind, the kind that said, "I see you before bed." She left another note on the kitchen counter. This one was written in neat cursive with a drawing of 3 small strawberry plants at the bottom. "Thank you for giving us room to grow. The girls are already calling this home. I think I am too." Sophie. Caleb placed it gently into the cookie tin on top of the other, not out of obligation, but because something inside him whispered, "It's okay to keep this." The storm rolled in suddenly that afternoon, sweeping down from the mountains with the fury of a forgotten sky. 1 minute, the girls were skipping rope in the dirt driveway. The next, the wind had snapped it from their hands. Thunder cracked through the valley, sharp and close. The girls squealed, running toward the cabin as Caleb stepped onto the porch, towel in hand. "Miles," he called. Come inside, bud." The boy didn't answer. It wasn't like him to stray far, but the garden had become a quiet refuge lately, and Caleb had seen him there that morning, watching, not playing. He dropped the towel and moved quickly toward the back of the cabin. There, just past the edge of the garden, Miles sat under the old cedar tree, knees tucked to his chest, staring up at the sky with wide, frozen eyes. He hadn't run. He hadn't flinched. He was locked. Caleb crouched in front of him. "Hey, buddy, can you hear me?" Miles blinked, but didn't speak. His hands clutched tightly at the hem of his shirt, his grounding gesture when the world got too big, too loud, too much. Thunder cracked again. Closer this time. Caleb's heart clenched. "Okay," he whispered. "It's just sound. It's not coming for you. Breathe with me, all right?" He reached out but stopped short. Miles had never liked being touched in panic mode. Caleb's fingers hovered inches from his son's shoulder, helpless. Then came the softest voice from behind them. "Can I try?" It was Sophie. Before Caleb could answer, she stepped forward, slowly kneeling beside him. She didn't touch Miles either. She simply sat. "Miles, I'm scared of thunder too," she said calmly. "When I was little, I used to pretend it was just a big drum, like the sky was part of a marching band." He didn't move. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded napkin. Inside was a single peppermint. "I brought this," she said gently. "It helps me when my tummy feels twisty. Would it help you too?" She laid it on the ground between them, then leaned back. No pressure. Minutes passed. Rain began to fall, gentle at first, then harder, pattering against the leaves like fingers on a roof. Sophie didn't flinch. She let the rain soak her braid, her shoulders, her shirt. Miles blinked again. Then slowly, one hand reached for the peppermint. Caleb exhaled, barely believing what he saw. The boy unwrapped it, popped it in his mouth, and whispered, "I don't like thunder." Sophie smiled, eyes soft. "Me neither." That night after the storm passed, and the girls were tucked in, Caleb stood on the back porch, watching the mist rise from the earth like breath. Sophie came out with 2 mugs of tea, mint and lemon balm from the garden. He spoke, Caleb said quietly. She nodded. He did. "You stayed in the rain with him. You would have done the same. I've tried for years. You're his anchor," she said. "He needs that. But sometimes it takes a stranger to walk through the storm with you. No expectations, just presence." He looked at her, then really looked, the way her eyes held years. She didn't talk about. The way her shoulders knew the weight of endurance, the way she saw people without trying to fix them. "You're good with him," he said. "I don't know about that," she replied. "But I know what it's like to be afraid of sound." She stared out into the trees. "My ex used to slam doors, yell over nothing. The girls used to shake when trucks passed by too close. Even now, loud noises make them freeze. I've learned to live quieter." Gentler, Caleb swallowed hard. "You've done more in a week than I've managed in years." "No," she said, firmly turning to him. "You gave him the space to survive. That matters." Inside, Miles was asleep. Deep, peaceful sleep. Lila had insisted on giving him one of her stuffed animals, a lopsided bunny named Marbles. To Caleb's shock, Miles hadn't refused. Instead, he'd whispered, "Tell her thank you," and held it to his chest. Before going to bed, Sophie handed Caleb another note, this time folded neatly into the shape of a star. Inside, written in purple marker, "Today we planted mint and courage. Both are growing, Lila, Ruby, Hazel, and Mommy too." Caleb placed the note inside the cookie tin, now filling fast. He didn't organize them. He didn't have to. Each one found its place like a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving, and somewhere deep in his chest, The silence began to crack like old ice giving way to spring. The rain had passed, but its scent still lingered earthy clean, like the world had been rinsed of dust and sorrow. Caleb stood at the window early the next morning, a mug of black coffee warming his palms, watching as the triplets played hopscotch on the stone path he once helped Amanda lay. The stones had faded their chalk outlines, smudged by weather and time. But the girls didn't mind. Lila called out numbers with authority. Ruby missed her jump and collapsed in laughter. Hazel as always watched before participating, testing the world in silence before joining its rhythm. Inside, Sophie moved through the kitchen with practiced grace, folding laundry while humming a folk tune Caleb couldn't place. The cabin hadn't known this kind of life in years. So much movement, so much sound that wasn't just the creak of old wood or the occasional knock of wind. Caleb sipped his coffee, slowly listening. Then Miles appeared. His feet, bare, pajama pants wrinkled from sleep. He moved quietly to the table and began organizing forks by size, a routine he repeated most mornings. But this time, something was different. He was humming. Caleb turned. "That tune, are you singing?" Miles looked up, startled, then nodded once. "She sings it in the morning." Sophie glanced over, her eyes warm. "It's a lullaby from Kentucky. My mama used to sing it when the power went out. Felt like the only thing that kept the walls from caving in." Caleb smiled faintly. "You've got a good memory." "Sometimes pain sharpens the details," she replied, not unkindly, "but so does gratitude." Later that day, as the sun climbed high and the girls retreated indoors for lemonade and storybooks, Sophie wandered to the attic ladder. She stood beneath it, looking up, then looked back at Caleb. "Do you mind?" He shook his head. "Just dust and old ghosts up there." She climbed carefully, her fingers brushing along the wood, as if reading Braille. Caleb followed slower, letting her explore. The attic was as he remembered: boxes stacked unevenly, old linens, forgotten tools, a trunk Amanda once used to store Christmas ornaments. Sophie moved with reverence, not intrusion, pausing at the cookie tin. She opened it. Inside were the girls' thank you notes, now joined by folded stars, doodled hearts, and one stick figure drawing of Caleb with a comically large wrench. But Sophie's fingers hovered over a different stack, old yellowing letters written in a rougher hand. She pulled one out, scanned it, and froze. To Amanda she read aloud. April 12th, today, Miles refused to eat his cereal. He said it reminded him of the moon. I didn't understand it, but I tried to smile anyway. Caleb sat on the nearby trunk, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. I used to write her letters, he said, voice quiet. After she passed, things I didn't get to say, things I was too angry or tired to express when she was alive. Sophie said nothing, just gently set the letter back. I guess, I thought. If I kept writing, he added, I could keep her here, in this house. In me, Sophie crouched beside him. You don't need paper to carry someone. You already do. They sat in silence, surrounded by time. Then Hazel's voice called up from below. Mommy, Ruby put a peanut in her ear again. Sophie chuckled. I should go. Caleb reached for her wrist, not firmly, just enough to pause her. I stopped writing. 2 years ago, he said I didn't feel her anymore. Only the weight. Sophie met his gaze. Maybe you were never meant to carry her forever. Maybe you were just supposed to carry her far enough until you could carry yourself again. She climbed down the ladder, leaving Caleb alone with the past. He looked around. The attic wasn't haunted. It was heavy, but not unkind. A place of memory, of release. Later that evening, while the girls painted rocks outside and Sophie made chicken soup with rosemary from the garden, Caleb opened the tin again. He added a new note, his handwriting rough but steady. Thank you for sending them, for the peppermint, for the song, for the girl who sits in storms and never flinches. He placed it at the bottom of the stack beneath Lila's stick figure drawing. That night before bed, Miles handed Sophie something a folded square of construction paper. Inside was a single line. Thank you for helping the thunder go away. She pressed the paper to her chest, tears welling but not falling. Some things didn't need to be said out loud to be understood. The power went out just after sunset. One moment, the cabin was bathed in warm lamplight, and the scent of Sophie's rosemary soup still lingered in the air. The next, darkness fell like a wool blanket, sudden and complete. The girls shrieked, half in fear, half in thrill, and Miles froze mid-step near the bookshelf, his small frame tensing like a wire pulled taut. Caleb grabbed the flashlight from the pantry without thinking. He flicked it on, casting long shadows across the knotty pine walls, and made a quick inventory in his head. Candles in the drawer matches by the stove, extra batteries in the toolbox. I've got it, he called out calmly. No one panic. But Sophie was already moving. She found the girls in the hallway, gathering them close, like a mother bird shielding her chicks. All right, explorers, she whispered. Time to use our indoor voices and our outside imaginations. Who wants to help find treasure in the dark? Lila lit up. I do. Ruby clung to her leg. Is the dark gonna eat us out, baby? Sophie said gently. The dark is just the light taking a nap. Caleb watched from the doorway as Sophie handed out flashlights like magic wands. Each girl suddenly transformed into a brave adventurer instead of a frightened child. Even Hazel, cautious and quiet, smiled as her beam of light danced across the ceiling. Then came Miles. He stood by the living room chair, hands pressed against his ears. Not from noise, but from the sudden shift light to dark, known to unknown. Caleb crouched beside him. It's okay, he said softly. Just a fuse. We've got candles. Remember what we practiced. Miles nodded faintly, breathing in short, controlled bursts. It's different, I know, Caleb said, but you're not alone. And for the first time, Miles didn't run to his room. He stayed. Together, they lit candles, one by the window, one on the kitchen counter, one near Amanda's old rocking chair that no one had dared use in years. The glow they gave off was soft, flickering, almost holy. It transformed the cabin into something older, quieter, like a time before grief, before fear, before loss. Sophie moved through the shadows with practiced ease. She found a box of old crayons and a worn notebook and sat the girls down at the kitchen table. Let's draw what we want to dream about tonight, she said. But only by candlelight. That's the rule. Caleb stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching as she turned a blackout into a memory. Later, when the girls had been carried to bed, sticky with apple slices and scribbled stars, Sophie brought out a dusty quilt and draped it over the living room rug. She sat cross-legged, a mug of tea in hand, and tilted her head toward Caleb. Join me, he hesitated, then sat. Outside, the wind had calmed. The hum of insects returned. Only the occasional creak of the old house reminded them how silent the world could be without electricity. Feels like the kind of night people used to tell stories, Sophie said, her voice low, before screens, before schedules. Caleb smiled faintly. We used to do that, Amanda and I, in the first few years here, before Miles was born, before everything. Sophie glanced at him, then back to the candle flame between them. Tell me something true, she said suddenly. Something you've never said out loud. Caleb looked at her eyebrows raised. Why, because it's dark, she replied. And in the dark, people speak more honestly. He thought for a moment, then said quietly, "I hated her for dying." The words fell like stones into the quiet. I loved her deeply, but for a long time, I hated her. For leaving, for making me do this alone, for not holding on longer. Sophie didn't flinch. "You." She sipped her tea, then spoke slowly. "I stayed with the wrong man for 2 years longer than I should have. I told myself I was doing it for the girls, but really, I was scared of being alone, of being judged, of failing." "You didn't fail," Caleb said softly. "Didn't I?" she asked. "I let them see too much, hear too much." There were nights I'd hold all 3 of them in my lap and whisper promises I wasn't sure I could keep. Her eyes met his. "You ever feel like love isn't enough?" Caleb exhaled. Every day, they sat in silence. Then Sophie leaned back, looking up at the ceiling. "Do you think we're allowed to be happy again? After everything?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at her, the curve of her neck in the candlelight, the faint scar near her eyebrow, the quiet strength in her shoulders. "I don't think happiness is something you earn," he said. Finally, "I think it's something you allow. A choice. Like breathing." She smiled barely. "I haven't allowed much lately," she admitted. "Maybe it's time." The candle flickered. He reached across the quilt, not to hold her hand, but to place his near hers, close enough that she could feel the warmth, not touching, not pushing, just there. And she didn't pull away. The ladder was old. Caleb had meant to replace it for years, just one of many quiet promises he made to himself after Amanda passed. He'd fixed the porch, reinforced the back steps, patched the shed roof twice. But the ladder that led to the tool loft above the garage, that had somehow slipped down the list. Until that morning, the late August sun burned high above the trees, and the girls were busy painting rocks in the shade, giggling about turning them into ladybugs and hedgehogs. Miles sat nearby, eyes on them, not quite playing but not retreating either. Sophie was inside organizing the pantry and humming an old gospel tune under her breath. Caleb had just wanted to grab a tin of screws, just a quick trip up, then back down. The wood cracked under his boot without warning. There was a sharp snap, the sound of his body crashing onto the concrete floor, and then silence, heavy and immediate. Sophie heard it before she saw it. The music stopped. She dropped the box of pasta in her hands and ran, heart already pounding. The garage door creaked open, and what she saw made the breath catch in her throat. Caleb lay on his side, twisted awkwardly, one arm bent beneath him. A slow, steady trickle of blood moved from his temple toward the oil-stained floor. His eyes fluttered, but didn't focus. "Caleb," she cried, already at his side, already checking his pulse. His breath, her own voice shaking as she called over her shoulder. "Lila, run to the house. Get my phone. Hurry." Miles appeared in the doorway. He froze, panic creeping up his spine like ice. But Sophie didn't shout. She turned to him, voice low, urgent, but gentle. "Miles, I need you. Can you help me?" His lip trembled. Is he gonna die?" "No," Sophie said, her hand pressing to Caleb's head, trying to stop the bleeding. "But I can't carry him. I need you to open the truck. Can you do that for me?" Miles looked at his father, the only constant in his life, the quiet giant who fixed things, made pancakes, and never complained when the world got too loud. He nodded, and then, for the first time, he ran toward the world instead of away from it. 15 minutes later, they were barreling down the gravel road, Sophie gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Miles sat beside her, silent, clutching Caleb's hand in the back seat. The hospital lights were harsh and cold. The smell of antiseptic hit like a wall. Doctors spoke in clipped, careful tones. Possible concussion compound, fracture in the wrist, observation required. Sophie nodded through it all, answering questions, filling out forms. She'd done this once before, with someone who'd hurt her. This time, it was different. This time, she felt as though something sacred was lying behind those swinging ER doors. It wasn't until an hour later, when Caleb was stabilized and resting, that she allowed herself to sit. She found a quiet bench near a vending machine and buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook, not from fear, but from the weight of how much she didn't know until today. She didn't know how fragile she'd become. She didn't know how much she'd come to rely on Caleb's quiet presence, his steady hands, the way he listened without judgment. She didn't know she could still love someone. Miles approached, holding a packet of peanut M&Ms in both hands. "I got these." "For him." Sophie looked up, smiling through her tears. "That's a good choice." I remembered he said they were his favorite. He sat beside her, legs dangling off the bench. I was scared, he admitted. "But you didn't yell. You didn't get loud." Sophie turned to him. "I used to think being brave meant not being afraid. But I think now it means doing the hard thing, even while you're afraid." Miles looked at her for a long moment. Then quietly, "I didn't run." "No," she whispered, voice thick. "You didn't." That night when they returned to the cabin, leaving Caleb in a hospital room under warm blankets and machines that beeped with quiet reassurance, the girls had already drawn "Get well." Soon posters taped across the living room walls. Hazel had spelled it, "Get well sewn," and drawn Caleb, holding a shovel with one arm. Lila had drawn him with a cape. "Because he's a fixer, Dad," she explained. "And even heroes fall sometimes." Sophie smiled, then cried. Later, when the house was still and the girls asleep, she found herself in the attic. She hadn't meant to go there, but her feet led her as if by instinct. She pulled open the tin and wrote a new letter. "Dear Caleb, today you fell and the world shook. Not just because you hit the ground, but because I realized something I hadn't dared admit. You've become part of the rhythm here, part of our breath. You're not just someone who took us in, you're someone we'd be lost without. And I'm scared to feel that again. But I do. I really, really do, Sophie." She folded it carefully and placed it under the note Caleb had written days earlier, the one about the peppermint and the girl who didn't flinch in the storm. Then she sat on the attic floor, lit only by a flashlight and memory, and whispered into the silence, "Please come home." The first night without Caleb was the quietest the cabin had ever felt. Even the girls seemed to sense it, their voices usually bright and overlapping, like spring robins, became gentle, tentative, as if afraid of shattering something invisible in the air. The wind moved through the trees without fanfare, and the old radio, usually whispering bluegrass or gospel in the background, sat silent. Sophie tucked the triplets into bed early. Hazel asked will he be okay, and Sophie had nodded, with a certainty she wasn't entirely sure she possessed. In truth, she hadn't stopped trembling since the moment they'd left him behind, in that stark, white room, pale and bandaged. That night, Miles didn't go to his usual corner to line up his toy animals. Instead, he climbed the attic ladder on his own. Sophie found him there, sitting cross-legged near the cookie tin, one hand resting on the lid. He looked up at her, uncertain. "I wanted to read," he said. She nodded and joined him. Together they opened the tin. The smell of aged paper and cedar dust rose up like an old hymn. Sophie handed him the first letter on top, a bright green envelope with hearts drawn in crayon. It was one of Lila's. He read it silently, then passed it to Sophie without a word. They moved through several more notes of gratitude, scribbled stories, Caleb's short reflections. There was a rhythm to it, small voices echoing across time, stitched together by kindness and memory. Then they found the envelope with no name. It was addressed to no one, written in Caleb's strong, angular handwriting. Sophie unfolded it with care. There are things you say out loud, and things you whisper into the walls, and then there are things you only ever write down, because writing is the only way you can breathe when the heart's too heavy to lift. This is one of those. I didn't expect to feel anything again. Not this kind of thing. Not in this house. But she brought in the girls and the laughter and the chaos, and it didn't feel like an invasion. It felt like spring thawing something that had been frozen too long. She doesn't know it yet, but I think she might be the letter I never got to send. Sophie folded the paper slowly, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't sure if she was ready to know that, but she was glad she did. Across from her, Miles had curled into himself, resting his chin on his knees. "I think he likes you," the boy said softly. Sophie looked at him surprised. "Why do you say that? He doesn't keep things unless they matter." Sophie smiled, her eyes glistening. "Is that right?" Miles nodded. "I broke a toy once. A wooden train. I thought he'd throw it away, but he didn't. He fixed it, even though the wheels still squeaked after. He said things worth fixing were worth keeping." Sophie looked down at the tin in her lap. "That sounds like him." Miles glanced at the window, then back at her. "Do you like him too?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out, brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, and said, "I think I've liked him for a long time. I was just too scared to admit it." Miles seemed to accept that. He leaned against her arm. It was the first time he'd done so without flinching. "I don't want him to go away," he whispered. "He's not going anywhere," Sophie said, more to herself than to him. The next morning, Sophie loaded the girls and Miles into the truck and drove them all to the hospital. Caleb was awake, propped up in a stiff bed, with a cast on his wrist and a butterfly bandage across his temple. He looked pale and tired, but alive. When the girls saw him, they ran, ignoring every nurse and hospital rule. Lila jumped onto the bed and hugged his uninjured side. Ruby cried. Hazel climbed up beside his legs and whispered, "We made soup, but it got cold." Caleb laughed his first real laugh in days and winced. Carefully said, "I've only got one working arm left." Miles stood near the doorway holding something wrapped in brown paper. Caleb noticed. "Hey, bud," he said gently. "What's that?" Miles approached, unwrapped the bundle, and handed over the object inside. It was the broken train. Repaired. The glue lines still visible, the paint chipped, but whole again. "I thought you'd want it," Miles said. "It was always yours." Caleb blinked, visibly. Moved. He reached out his good hand and held the train like it was made of glass. "Thank you," he said. Then Sophie stepped forward, clutching her bag close to her chest. She didn't speak, not yet. Instead, she pulled out a sealed envelope and handed it to him. He opened it, unfolded the letter inside, and read. When he looked up, there was a question in his eyes, unspoken, unsure. Sophie nodded. I meant every word she said, even the ones I didn't know how to write. Caleb held her gaze, his throat working. I think I've been waiting for that letter for a long time," he said quietly. Then he smiled, wry, soft, familiar. "Still not sure how I feel about the Cape drawing, though." Sophie laughed, and somewhere behind her, Lila shouted, "You are a hero." That evening when they returned to the cabin, the wind had picked up slightly. The attic window creaked. Sophie climbed the ladder alone. This time opened the tin and placed Caleb's unaddressed letter back inside, now folded together with her reply. They didn't need names on them anymore. They both knew who they were for. Snow fell early that December, blanketing the cabin in a soft hush that muffled even the crunch of boots on the front steps. The world outside was white, and still the air tinged with wood smoke and the scent of pine. Inside life was anything but quiet, Lila and Ruby had taken it upon themselves to decorate the entire cabin using paper chains, glitter, and more tape than Caleb thought was possible. Hazel had spent hours arranging the nativity set by the fireplace, placing each figure with care, then repositioning them a dozen times. Sophie baked small apple crisps in ceramic ramekins, filling the house with a scent that wrapped around every wall like a familiar blanket. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, one arm still in a brace, but no longer in pain. The girls had taken turns signing his cast. Lila drew a snowman. Ruby wrote, "Mr. Fixer," and Hazel left a simple heart. Sophie had written only one word near his wrist, in small cursive. Home Miles was stringing popcorn garlands by the window, his brow furrowed in concentration. He'd insisted on doing it by hand. No help, no shortcuts. Sophie noticed he hummed when he worked now. Not always, but often. "Enough trees ready," Caleb called, standing carefully near the corner where Amanda's old Christmas tree stand, weighted, restored, and cleaned. Sophie brought in the tree. It wasn't grand or symmetrical, but it was real, pine-scented, and full of history. The girls cheered as they carried in boxes of ornaments, each one telling a different story. Some were Amanda's still wrapped in faded tissue paper. Others were handmade paper stars, pipe cleaner angels, popsicle stick snowflakes. "This one's from when I was in second grade," Caleb said, holding up a bulb with glittered glue, spelling CW in shaky letters. Sophie smiled. "Did your mom keep everything?" "Just about." "She'd be proud of this," she said softly, motioning to the scene around them. "I think she'd like you," he replied. She didn't answer, just reached for another ornament. When it was time to light the tree, Caleb hesitated. The outlet had been finicky since the fall, and he wasn't sure it could handle the load. But before he could move, Miles stepped forward. "I can do it," he said. Sophie and Caleb both paused. Miles knelt, carefully plugged in the cord, and stood back as the lights came alive, tiny glowing multicolored stars blinking to life. The room filled with a collective gasp from the girls. "You did it," Ruby shouted, tackling him in a hug. To everyone's surprise, he didn't pull away. Instead, Miles patted her shoulder and smiled. Thanks, that evening they gathered for a small Christmas dinner, nothing fancy but full of warmth. Mashed potatoes, roasted chicken, corn muffins, cranberry sauce in the shape of a can. The girls wore matching sweaters Sophie had found at a thrift store and altered by hand. Caleb carved the chicken with his good arm, and when Miles passed him a plate without being asked, their eyes met with a quiet pride that needed no words. After dessert, they all curled up in the living room. Sophie lit a fire, the radio softly playing. Silent night. The girls unwrapped homemade gifts, painted rocks, bracelets, a magic potion made of glitter and water. Caleb gave Sophie a wooden recipe box he'd crafted before the fall, engraved with her name. She opened it slowly, eyes misting as her fingers traced the grain. Inside, tucked beneath the lid, was a folded note. "To the woman who turned my silence into song. Thank you for filling the spaces I thought were meant to stay empty. You didn't just fix what was broken. You made it beautiful again, CW." She looked up, and in that look said more than any letter could. Then Miles stood holding something behind his back. "I made this," he said, shyly, handing Sophie a small ornament crafted from driftwood and copper wire. It was a circle imperfect but whole, with 5 tiny notches etched into the top one for each of us. He explained. Sophie knelt, took the ornament, and held it to her chest. "Can I hang it?" he asked. She nodded, and together they found the perfect branch. After the girls had fallen asleep in a tangle of tinsel and bedtime stories, Caleb and Sophie stood by the window, watching snow fall in silence. You built something here, he said, quietly. Not just for them, for me, for Miles. I didn't do it alone. He turned to her, eyes full. You did something I didn't think possible. What's that? You brought Christmas back to this house, and to my son. She reached for his hand. I think she said, slowly. This is the first Christmas I've felt safe in years. They stood like that for a long while. Two people who had been broken and lost, now finding each other in the hush of falling snow. Neither said the word, love, but it was there in the touch, in the light, in every quiet thing they did for each other. And in the attic, the cookie tin held a new letter, written in a child's blocky handwriting. Dear everyone, thank you for the lights and the tree and for being my forever family. Love, Miles. Winter hung long in Vermont, but inside the cabin, spring had already begun its quiet return. The garden was still buried under snow, but a new trellis leaned against the back wall of the shed. Caleb's latest project. He'd started it with one arm still in a brace, determined to have it ready by the thaw. For Sophie's beans, he'd said, then immediately blushed and changed the subject. But Sophie had heard it, and she'd smiled to herself, letting the words settle where they needed to settle. The house, once echoing with silence, now breathed with rhythm. Morning tea, Miles, counting spoons, the girls' footsteps overhead. Laughter. Real laughter. It was late February when Caleb asked Sophie to walk with him into the woods behind the cabin. The sun had returned pale, but present, and the sky was a soft, forget-me-not blue. He'd carved a narrow trail through the snow, each step careful, deliberate. They walked side by side in coats and scarves, boots crunching with each footfall. Neither spoke at first. They didn't need to. Eventually, they reached a small clearing, quiet and bare, except for a single wooden bench, newly built, facing a rise in the land, where wildflowers would soon bloom again. I made this spot for Amanda, Caleb said after a while. Back when I thought grief was something you had to carry alone. Sophie turned to him, her expression gentle. I came here for months. Every Sunday I'd sit and read her letters, even the ones I never sent. Then one day I stopped coming. I thought it meant I was forgetting her. I didn't realize until you came along. It meant I was finally beginning to forgive myself. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, faded cream sealed with wax. This is the last letter I wrote her, he said, holding it out. I never opened it, never read it aloud. Sophie took it, her fingers brushing his. He gestured to the bench. Would you sit with me? They sat. She opened the letter carefully. Caleb's handwriting was firm, unshaken, full of weight. Dear Amanda, it took me too long to understand that letting go isn't betrayal, it's permission. You loved me enough to leave a space for someone else. I see that now. I don't know if I'm ready to love again, but I do know this. There's a woman here who plants hope in old soil, who sings when the lights go out, who listens like every word matters. The girls call me Daddy Caleb now. Miles holds their hands. And me? I laugh again. You would have liked her. She would have liked you too. This is the last letter I'll write you because I think the rest were meant for her. Thank you for the love that taught me how to recognize it again. Goodbye, Caleb. Sophie wiped her eyes, folded the letter with care, and slipped it back into its envelope. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Caleb reached into his coat again, this time pulling out something small and round. Not a ring, but a key. It was tied with a ribbon, the exact shade of Sophie's favorite scarf. He placed it in her palm. This is for the drawer in the bedroom, he said. The one I never let anyone open. It's where I keep the things I'm most afraid to lose. Sophie stared at the key, her breath caught. "I don't have a question," he said softly. "Not yet. No ceremony, no speech, just this." He looked at her eyes steady. A choice. Sophie blinked back tears. "What if I'm still a little broken?" Caleb smiled. "Then we can be broken together." She leaned in, forehead resting against his, the air between them, still and sacred. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. "Not now, not ever." They didn't kiss. "Not yet, they didn't need to," the snow whispered around them, and the trees stood witness. And somewhere deep beneath the frozen earth, the first roots of spring began to stir. The attic was warmer now. Spring had finally returned to Vermont, bringing with it the scent of damp earth, lilac buds, and something even rarer. Peace. The kind that settles not only over a house, but inside the people who live in it. The cabin, once quiet and haunted by memories, now pulsed with a living rhythm. Caleb stood by the garden, sleeves rolled, planting a row of sugar snap peas along the new trellis. The soil was soft, the sunlight golden on his back, and the laughter of 3 girls carried on the breeze like music. Inside, Sophie hummed as she kneaded dough. The kitchen window was cracked open, letting in the breeze and the soft clatter of Miles playing cards with Hazel at the table. His laugh, light and unguarded, broke Sophie's concentration for a moment. She leaned against the counter, smiling. She still had days where it felt unreal, this life, this home, but then the girls would tug on her sleeve, or Miles would lean his head against her shoulder, without fear, or Caleb would take her hand in the quiet of the evening, and it would all become real again. Love, it turned out, didn't return with fireworks. It crept in gently. It stayed. That afternoon, the whole family gathered in the living room, surrounded by construction paper markers, envelopes, and glue sticks. Sophie had announced a new tradition. Letter Day. "The rules are simple," she told them. "Everyone writes 1 letter today, not to anyone we know, but to someone we might meet one day. Someone who needs hope." Ruby raised her hand. "Like Santa." "Sort of," Sophie laughed. "But even better, because these letters aren't just wishes. They're gifts." Hazel bit her lip. "What if we don't know what to say?" "You just speak from your heart," Caleb said, sitting beside them. "That's more than enough." The girls got to work. Lila folded hers into the shape of a butterfly. Ruby added, "glitter stars." Hazel spent a long time writing slowly, each word chosen with care. Miles sat apart, at first watching. Then he reached for a pen. Caleb watched him, heart full. When they were finished, Sophie gathered the letters and placed them into a new tin box, fresh blue with golden flowers painted on the lid. She turned to Caleb. "Would you?" she asked. He nodded and carried the box up the attic stairs, the girls following behind like ducklings. In the attic, Caleb placed the new tin next to the old one. Then, without fanfare, he opened the old box and took out 2 envelopes. One was the final letter Amanda had written to him before she passed, never opened until recently. The other was Sophie's letter, the one she had left in the hospital. He placed them together, bound in a ribbon, and then gently he closed the lid. "This box," he said to the children, "is for the past, for the things that made us who we are." He tapped the new one, "And this one, this is for who we're becoming." Sophie stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes glistening. Later that evening, as the stars bloomed over the treetops and the girls fell asleep, tangled in each other on the rug, Caleb and Sophie sat on the porch swing. A breeze stirred the wind chimes. "I want to ask you something," he said. Sophie turned to him. He didn't reach for a ring. He didn't kneel. He just held out his hand. "I don't want to change what we have. I just want to give it a name, something that means forever." Sophie took his hand. "You already did," she whispered. "You called it home." They stayed like that, rocking gently, while inside Miles crept out of bed with a flashlight and one last piece of folded paper. He climbed to the attic, opened the blue tin, and placed his letter on top. It read, "Dear you, I don't know who you are yet, but I know how it feels to be alone. I know how scary thunder can be. I know what it means when someone stays. I hope you find your person. I hope you learn that broken things can still work. And if no one's told you yet, there's still time. Still love. Still room. I'm proof. Love, Miles." A young girl grown, now 22, dark curls tucked behind one ear, opened a weathered letter she found in a second-hand bookstore tucked into a small Vermont town. It was written in purple ink on paper that smelled faintly of cinnamon. "Thank you for the light, for the noise, for the second chance. We didn't know we were someone's miracle, but we were. And you might be too. A family, once lost, now found." She smiled, folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket, and for the first time in months, she walked toward home. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? And what part of the story stayed with you the most? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, consider subscribing to Soul Moments Story. It helps us bring you more true-to-life tales, filled with kindness, hope, and the quiet beauty of everyday people. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for spending time with us today. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and never stop believing in second chances.